But welcome everybody to the Munk School of Global Affairs. Welcome also to people watching from far and wide online. This is such a treat for the Munk School of Global Affairs. We always see ourselves as a convening space for a global dialogue, for a global conversation. And this is precisely the kind of event where we can host, in this case, Dr. Ahmad Shaheed, who we can host here at the Munk School of Global Affairs to talk about questions involving human rights, to speak about questions involving Iran, all of which in his current capacity as the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, working in a sense independently but appointed by the Human Rights Council. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Ahmad Shaheed and then go on to a half an hour or so discussion by Dr. Shaheed, followed by questions and answers from the audience. Well, presumably questions from the audience and answers by Dr. Shaheed. So the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran is Dr. Ahmad Shaheed, who is toward the tail end of a 2-week fact-finding mission in the United States and in Canada to gather information about alleged human rights violations in Iran. The Human Rights Council appointed Dr. Ahmad Shaheed, who comes from the Maldives, to the Office of Special Rapporteur on this particular situation in June 2011, and he began his mandate just a couple of months later, if that. Dr. Shaheed is the 4th Special Rapporteur to Iran, and as Special Rapporteur, he's independent, and this is a point that those of us who don't study the United Nations, I always need to make clear to. He is independent from any government or organization and serves as Special Rapporteur in his individual capacity and, in that case, as an expert. Dr. Ahmad Shaheed's expertise comes from the long history of doing work in and around human rights, both in the Maldives and on the international stage. He is an internationally recognized expert on foreign policy, on international diplomacy, on democratization and human rights reform, particularly in Muslim states. After joining the Ministry of Foreign Service and Foreign Affairs in 1982, Dr. Ahmad Shaheed had this meteoric rise through the Foreign Service ranks in the Republic of the Maldives, twice holding the office of Minister of Foreign Affairs. He played a leading role in the Maldives' own democratic transition and its human rights reform processes, going from a 30-year-old autocracy to a vibrant Muslim democracy and widespread and strong human rights safeguards. So this is one of those situations where, as an academic who does work in and around human rights, I have the privilege of holding here at the University of Toronto the George Ignatieff Chair in Peace and Conflict Studies. You find yourself completely overwhelmed by the amount of work one person can do in the context of human rights work and human rights reform. If you just chronicle some of the work he did in and around the Maldives, this included transforming the previous government's stand on human rights by securing political approval for the creation of a National Human Rights Commission in August 2003, acceding to the UN Convention Against Torture, or CAT as we call it, in April 2004, was a co-founder of the New Maldives faction within cabinet, which worked to promote what we like to think about in Canada as democracy, good governance, and human rights. During his first term as foreign minister for 2 years, the Maldives turned out to accede to the vast majority of international human rights conventions, and during that same time, the Maldives became, and I think this is no small point, one of the original signatories of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, or as acronyms go in international law, OPCAT. Dr. Shaheed also, and this is, I think, important given his current situation himself, took the decision at that time, within the context of the Maldives, to extend a standing invitation to all UN human rights special mandate holders. And so, as we'll talk about today, I believe this is particularly a key point when thinking about his own work with respect to Iran. One can go on about the achievements in his second spell as foreign minister for another 2 years, which included consolidating democratic and human rights reforms across the country, But if you take just one achievement there, it's that the Maldives in 2010 was elected to the Human Rights Council, which, if I remember my Human Rights Council history correctly, is not long after the reform that produces the Human Rights Council, with a record number of votes. In 2010, he also joined the rest of cabinet, thus ending his stint as foreign minister in resigning in protest over corruption amongst members of parliament and what he perceived and the party perceived as a separation of powers in the country, a weakening of the separation of powers. In April 2009, as sort of after all of this work, prior to his current appointment, Dr. Shaheed was presented with the Muslim Democrat of the Year Award by the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy in Washington. In 2010, the President of Albania awarded him the Medal of Gratitude for his contribution to peace and human rights in the Balkans. And he was awarded an honorary professorship from the Rinvest University in Kosovo for his contribution to peace and human rights in Kosovo. So, as a faculty member who sits here at the Munk School of Global Affairs, one sits back and says, well, that's okay. Seems like an all right guy, does a lot of work, but does he write? Does he teach? Does he do all those things that seem to take up the rest of the time we have? Well, so it turns out he does that too. He's been a visiting professor of political science at City University of New York, Brooklyn since March 2012. And currently holds the visiting professorship of human rights practice at the University of Essex. He holds a PhD from the University of Queensland in the field of international relations, writes across topics, including issues around economic development, terrorism, diplomacy, and democracy. So on behalf of the Munk School of Global Affairs and the University of Toronto, we're thrilled to be hosting Dr. Ahmad Shaheed here at the University of Toronto and at the Munk School, and we look forward to his presentation. I should note that after his presentation, during questions and answers, Natasha, who is sitting there with cue cards, will distribute cue cards for your questions. This allows us to organize questions, and Natasha will then bring them up to the front for me to read out. So thank you again, and welcome to Dr. Shaheed.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Professor Ron Levy, for the very generous introduction, and to Munk School for hosting this event and inviting me to be here today. I thank you all for being here today to listen to me, and I look forward to a very fruitful interaction with you at the end of my initial presentation. I have a challenge tonight. I have, like you heard, I have now done several presentations on my tour, but these have either been audiences which had either predominantly Iranian diaspora members there or academic members. I think I have a mixed audience tonight, so I really have to see how I suit my talk accordingly. Because when I have an Iranian audience, I don't talk about what's wrong with their country, they know it well. I talk about my methods of work and what's the best way that the UN system can be leveraged to secure reform in Iran. When I have a non-Iranian audience, I do speak about the challenges in Iran because some of it are not so widely known. I think I'll have to go for a mix tonight, so forgive me if I don't go into detail in any of the aspects I shall cover, but feel free to ask me questions as you wish. Now, let me talk about how special procedures work. We begin typically by talking about how under-resourced we are, because that does affect the work we do. I am independent, which is good, but that comes at a cost, which means no money. I don't have any state to back me. I don't have any resources at my disposal. The UN does give me one very competent staff, but that's only one staff, and Iran is 70 million population with a big government and so on and so forth. I do get funded for my travels, which are 2 trips for fact-finding a year, 14 days each, which Dr. Larjani says is woefully insufficient. He's right on that. And of course, a few trips to Geneva and New York for my reports. Now, apart from my resources, it's also good to tell you what tools I have. I am the mandate holder tasked to assess Iran. Therefore, what do I have to do that with? I am given 2 reports a year, each report of no more than 10,700 words. I meet many Iranians who complain to me bitterly that one or other case was not mentioned, or this or that issue was not discussed. But I have an ironclad limitation. I cannot exceed that, 10,700 words. So I have to fit into that word limit. For my pains in doing that, I am rewarded with, in Geneva, 1 hour of debate with member states. There are 47 member states. Each can take the floor. And in Geneva, NGOs can participate in this as well. In my experience, Iran sends a lot of government-friendly NGOs to Geneva, the gungos as it were. They can speak too, and they can run down the clock as well. In New York, I get 45 minutes to an audience of 190 member states, all of whom can speak, but not all of them do. But if they did, you can imagine the amount of time that would be there for a debate. So really, there are limitations imposed by time and resources as well. But in these 2 forums, there is a possibility of floating resolutions which will call for votes amongst member states, which will identify issues that Iran must respond to, and then also attach to it the level of support there is for these initiatives by the world body. An important indicator for any country to determine how it is doing with regard to its reputation or its support internationally. In New York too, this is there. There's a resolution which is proposed each year, and it identifies issues of concern in Iran, sometimes condemns developments, and certainly calls on the government to do certain measures. And the vote in these resolutions is a good indicator to Iran also the kinds of pressure it is facing, the kind of demands that have been made upon it, and also to what degree it should respond to these. If the vote is low, they can say, well, the world audience is telling you there's not much to worry about. If the vote is high, of course, they go back to Tehran and they worry about it. If a country changes the vote, they're very concerned. They send missions to these countries to see if they can get the vote back. So it's not all that limited. The world opinion is important to Iran, and in these forums, in these debates, when they produce a resolution, that is an important outcome in terms of perhaps fractionally advancing the cause of human rights. In addition to these reports, I am also allowed to write what are called allegation letters to the government of Iran. That is, if it comes to my notice that a particular case represents a violation of human rights, whether it's an arrest of an individual or something else, if I can verify that information from a couple of independent sources, then I can place across to the government of Iran an allegation letter saying, this has come to my attention, this violates such and such obligation of the government of Iran, we are supposed to do this, can you please clarify the situation and confirm the facts? If they are correct, please do the following. Now, typically, Iran ignores this, but it knows that a certain action has been noted and that somebody is watching, and then that somebody can become some people watching, and therefore that issue rises on the international agenda. I can also write what are called urgent appeals, and this I do in situations requiring an urgent intervention, typically an execution. If I am notified of an impending execution where there is reason to believe that there is a miscarriage of justice, or in most cases in Iran, executions are very problematic. So if I get word of an impending execution, then I would consider issuing an urgent appeal to the government of Iran. If I'm also present with information that people may be facing other urgent situations like ill health in prison requiring urgent attention, perhaps not given to them, again, I would consider doing that. I usually do this not alone, not singly, but jointly with other rapporteurs, because that builds a coalition of people that Iran must then take into consideration. But these are private or confidential communications, not private, but confidential communications. I cannot publish them until a certain time has lapsed, because Iran must be given a certain time to respond to these allegations. But I can, however, go public on certain issues and make press statements. And this week, I am about to make one on reports of some impending executions that are there. I have made a large number of press statements. I say large in comparison to my colleagues in the other mandates. I think perhaps Iran requires that, but I'm quite prolific in producing public statements because I believe that certain things have to be brought to public attention. So these are things I have been able to do so far. The other main tool in my toolbox is the country visit, which is where I get to go to Iran, I get to visit prisons or other places I want to inspect, get to talk to people I want to talk to, or talk to the government, ask questions, see files, and so on and so forth. But this requires their cooperation and consent. So I cannot go to Iran until they will give me a visa to go there. I cannot go to Iran until they would agree that I can do all these things I mentioned without hindrance to the efforts I must put, and also without jeopardizing or acting in reprisals against those who might cooperate with me. Quite often, well, not quite often, but sometimes countries threaten people who would talk to mandate holders. In Iran's case, there have been reports in the past when some had gone, people have been arrested for lining up to meet a rapporteur. Rapporteurs have been thrown out of prison because they were in Section 209 in prison. The team was thrown out because despite the government agreeing for them to be there, the officials there didn't think they should be there. So a country visit takes place with the consent and cooperation of the country concerned, but this is a very powerful tool because then the report one files back after the visit is quite credible. Right now, when I file a report, Iran says, well, he hasn't been here. So what is he talking about? Now, that is quite a powerful comeback for many delegations. But if you look at the detail, not being allowed to go to Iran hasn't prevented me from my work. I have been able to interview about 500 Iranians, about a third of whom actually live in the country. And these interviews take about an average over 1 hour. And I have reported quite a large number of them in my reports, but I only report those matters I can corroborate with 2 independent witnesses. So I have not been deterred from my work because I have not been allowed to go into the country. So these are my tools, and this is what I can do. Now, how do I assess Iran? I'm often asked the question. Iran says we are an Islamic country, therefore you should not judge us by anything other than Islamic Sharia. Now, Iran also tells me that I must abide by the code of conduct that's now being imposed upon mandate holders. That's a code passed by the Council of UN Member States, which requires us to follow certain practices in regard to how we obtain information, how we report that information, and so on and so forth. This code also says that I must apply in assessing Iran's human rights record by internationally recognized standards. So Sharia law does not become an internationally recognized standard because the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights is not recognized as such. But Iran is party to 2 major UN covenants, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. These are the 2 main yardsticks to measure Iran. Iran has signed these without any reservations. So it must comply with the provisions of these 2 covenants. That is one yardstick I use. The other is the Universal Periodic Review that Iran accepted and went through 3 years ago at the UN, Human Rights Council. All the UN member states voluntarily submit to this review, where they get about, I think, 3 to 6 hours of debate with member states. They review Iran's performance. Iran gets to present its view. Others get to present their view. And then at the end of it, they make recommendations, and the country concerned says, I will accept this and not that, and so on and so forth. In Iran's case, over 180 recommendations were made. Iran accepted 123 recommendations. Now, I ask Iran, okay, you said you will do these things. What are you doing with those things now? That's the other yardstick. Now, beyond that, there are certain things called customary international law. So whether a country has signed onto a covenant or not, customary international law is something they have to uphold. So I even use those norms to measure Iran by. And in the last 2 to 3 years, Iran has been reviewed by the 2 treaty bodies, the experts who assess a country's performance on treaties that are signed. The 2 treaty bodies who have reviewed Iran, its performance. First of all, in 2011, Iran was reviewed by the Human Rights Committee to see how far it was complying with the provisions of the ICCPR, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And they they make concluding observations, and they identify 4 issues for urgent response in 1 year's time. And the same review was done this year in May for Iran's performance on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant. So their observations, again, are quite well respected, well regarded. They are independent and credible. I use these also to again ask Iran, okay, what have you done with these measures? And where are you on these? So this is how I assess Iran's progress. You will note in my reports, I focus a lot on the civil and political rights. This is partly because in the UPR process, Iran accepted about 35%, the proposals Iran accepted, out of which 35% what to do with civil and political rights. Also because, in my view, a lot of what we see happening going wrong in Iran will be addressed if Iran began to address these issues. So my reports focus a lot on this, but I have pursued what is called an embracive view in my reports. I checked my predecessors. Their method was to identify core issues and follow Iran over time on these issues. My view was that the problems are so diverse that I would attempt to include all aspects of key human rights violations in Iran. So I cover a much wider range of issues. In my reports, I have covered about 8 key areas. I will list them to you today. And I also have under review 3 other aspects on which I shall report on the time to come. I might add just one more thing here. My mandate is for 1 year only. And it's renewed at the end of that year by a vote in the Council. So Iran gets each year to find ways to end the mandate. And those who support the mandate must find ways each year to see that they can actually get the support for that mandate. So there's a huge political process that comes around the mandate, which again has implications to the way in which one should strategize one's approach to human rights change in Iran. Now, one of the reasons why Iran seeks to wind down the mandate is the claim that the UN is being selective in targeting Iran. This is something that requires actually, I think, some consideration. Iran says, look at Saudi Arabia. There's no mandate holder. Look at Guantanamo Bay. Look at Israel. There are their rapporteurs. And of course, the answer is actually, there is an answer for all these questions, and Iran hasn't got it right. First of all, there is a rapporteur to Israel. I'm not talking about Israel today, but I just want to point out that the argument there is none for Israel isn't valid. The rapporteur has a different name. His name is Rapporteur for the Occupied Territories. And his mandate is, unlike mine, somewhat a permanent mandate. It is there so long as Israel occupies these territories. It's not a 1-year renewal mandate. So he is on more solid ground and therefore able to be far more active and perhaps aggressive in his approach to the mandate. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a mandate, but Saudi Arabia receives mandate holders, thematic mandate holders regularly. There are country mandate holders like I am for about 11 countries, North Korea, Burma, Haiti, Somalia, Sudan, Iran, and so on. And there are about 40 thematic mandate holders looking at issues of concern globally: torture, right to food, women's issues, judiciary, and so on and so forth. Now, Saudi Arabia receives regularly mandate holders to that country. I'm not defending any country here, but when it comes to the Council, the big concern is of a country who does not receive a rapporteur, and therefore there is no knowledge about what's going on. If you're blocking visits to the country, then you think the worst, that something really bad could be happening. If doors are open, you can go and see what's going on, then you have some sense that perhaps you can watch things as they develop. If you can't have access, then often some of the worst things happen in a country. Likewise, the US, I think, is a country with the highest number of rapporteurs visiting in any given year recently. So therefore, you have a sense that if something goes wrong in the US, for example, you can always talk about it domestically, or even have a rapporteur go there and talk about it. So there is an open door through which you can know what's going on. And this goes for most countries to which there are no country rapporteurs. I'm not at all comparing US with any other country. The next point is, Iranians generate complaints about their country. Well, all people generate complaints about their country. In the Maldives, for example, people complain about the Maldives government to the UN. And these reports come when the people have their rights violated. These reports come. There's a mechanism through which UN will write to this country saying, we have got this information from this country. This is wrong. Can you please clarify the facts and respond and explain what's going on? Now, Iran doesn't respond to these letters. So there's a very large volume of unanswered communications to Iran from the UN system. That again creates a worry. So when you don't have rapporteurs going there, Iran's last visit was 2005. That's this, notwithstanding Iran saying we have the doors open for everybody, which one assumes is a good sign. And Iran had in fact agreed to have, I think, 3 people go there even after 2005, but they're still waiting for dates to be confirmed. So for the past 8 to 9 years, no one has gone to Iran from the thematic mandate procedures. That again creates concern. So Iran is, in that sense, a special case. And now, of course, add to that, of course, is the reports that came after elections 4 years ago, where people saw in the, all over the world, saw on their TV screens Nada Sultani getting shot, and many others getting beaten up by government agents on motorbikes and whatever else. So you saw these scenes played out live, and people don't expect violence to be part of the electoral process. And again, that was part of the concerns that were there. Now, moving on to what I address, I find 3 basic issues in Iran, and I'd like to speak in very, very broad terms here. One is the fact that the attempt to apply classical Sharia law in the 21st century creates problems, and you have this in Iran writ large. A number of the issues that we come across arises because of an attempt by Iran to apply the classical Sharia law in the modern context. And this creates tensions between Iran's international obligation under ICCPR and its own laws. As an example, Iran's constitution recognizes certain religions as protected religions, but it then leaves out the Baha'is. And if you talk to them, they say, well, Baha'is are not part of the people of the book or whatever. So the whole idea of lack of equality before the law comes from application of Sharia law. And there are many other aspects of this. The whole idea of corporal punishment, stoning, amputation, and all this lot of capital crimes in Iran, again, trace their origins back to Sharia. So a lot of what you find problematic in Iran is traced back to attempt to apply classical Sharia law in Iran. I say classical Sharia law because you have many other countries in the Islamic world which don't do this. There are some countries who apply laws similar to Iran, but there are many who say they are Sharia-based jurisdictions but don't feel the need to chop hands and stone people. So there is a distinction to be made, I think, in what Iran does. Now, the second broad aspect of Iran's human rights issues is the security counter discourse they use. Many human rights violators, countries, often resort to national security as a defense of what they do. This is quite a common thing, and unfortunately, many countries in the UN find that to be often, well, a reasonable excuse. In Iran's case, of course, this is developed into a very, very wide context, and the problem arises when Iran uses permissible limitations under international law in very broad terms to, in fact, defeat that right. So, for example, there are limitations on right to free speech under international law. But Iran uses these so broadly that, in fact, you cannot open your mouth. Any way that would be critical of the government. But criticizing the government is protected speech under international law. And, of course, this goes on from there to propaganda against the state, for acting against national security, and so on and so forth. Same with right to association, right to assembly. In fact, Iran's constitution grants these rights, but then says subject to Islamic criteria. And that criteria under Article 4 of the constitution is determined by the Guardian Council. And you don't actually know on any given day what the criteria is because this can change over time as well. They don't publish what the criteria are. You just learn them at times as you go along. So the use of permissive limitations very broadly in ways that actually defeat that right is the second serious concern I have with Iran. And then, of course, for example, if you take the press law, there are 17 occasions of impermissible content, and these include things like things that cause damage to the foundation of the republic, insults to Islam and sanctities, offends leader of the revolution, creates discord. I mean, This is, again, very liberally interpreted so as to block any form of speech that is critical of the authorities or the people's beliefs. Baha'is have reported to me the very fact that they speak of their faith can become something that violates Islamic values. The fact that somebody might pass on a Persian Bible is sometimes seen as an act against the state religion. So this is defined so broadly that any action the state doesn't like people to do becomes captured within the parameters of these laws. And then, of course, the other concern is the fact that Iran simply does not observe its own laws at times. Again, Iran's law requires that political offenses and the press offenses should be tried in a court with a jury. But the reports I have not come across a single case where there has been a political offender or a journalist tried before a jury. They always say they get referred to the revolutionary court. Now, Iran, of course, has laws against torture, against arbitrary arrest, against due process rights are guaranteed. But stories that come to me, and these are verified across the board, are often of people arrested without a warrant, held in solitary confinement for lengthy periods, subjecting them to psychological torture, pressure, and sometimes even physical torture, pushed through the Revolutionary Council without access to a lawyer, certainly not in the investigative stage, but even if in latter stage, only for a few minutes without a proper chance to defend oneself. Trials last in very short duration. I have met a family of mother and father who told me that their two sons were executed after a sentence that in a trial that lasted, I think, 3 minutes or something. Even if it was the whole day, come on, it's an execution. So the whole point of trials lasting for a few minutes to a couple of hours is the story I have. That is a very, very serious concern. This is a violation of Iran's own laws. Likewise, in terms of the treatment of minorities and people of the faith, Iran's law says that you're not supposed to question people's faith. But they are. I have reports of people being asked of what faith they are. We have reports of assemblies being disrupted where people come and ask, okay, what's your name? To see if the person is a Muslim or non-Muslim. If they raid a house church, for example, they're very keen to find out if people there are actually Christians as they would recognize them, or people with perhaps Muslim identities, in which case their question about their faith, if they don't recant, of course, they have legal liability falling upon them. These are all not permitted under Iran's own laws. Now, I have also reported extensively about both impunity and torture, because both are related. Torture, I have said, in Iran is endemic, it's systemic, systematic, and widespread. I don't say it lightly. I have received a number of testimonies in my interviews. In addition to that, I engaged a UK-based organization called Freedom from Torture. They've done thousands of victim analysis based on the UN system of Istanbul Protocol. That is the forensic procedure followed in doing torture investigations. They did a sample of 50 Iranians who had come out of Iran after the election violence 4 years ago. They had lengthy forensic investigations, done by medical experts and so on and so forth. And they came to the conclusion that in nearly every case, they were reporting credible blunt force trauma. Everybody was beaten in custody. And to our shock and horror, they also reported widespread sexual violence, sexual assault in prison, 60%. 25% of men reporting rape, same percentage of women reporting rape. And of course, a lot of other also quite cruel treatment in prison. So this is something I've been reporting on, I'm very concerned about, and I link that to impunity. Just last week, or just this month, just as I began this current tour, I heard reports that the Kahrizak trials were over, sentences were passed, and Mr. Murtazawi, accused of involvement in the death of 3 persons in torture and custody in the prison, was sentenced for a fine of $60. Traffic fines are probably more than that. And then a five-year suspension from any public office. Now, that is injustice. And this is the kind of practice that actually encourages torture. And that's what creates impunity. And if you look at Iran's history, from more recent events right through the election violence of 4 years ago, to the chain massacres, chain killings of the late 1990s, through to the alleged mass killings of 88 and earlier in the decade. None of this have been properly investigated. And you can't end torture, you can't have rule of law until you ended impunity. And accountability has to be established. And this is something, again, I am writing in my report. Now, executions, again, both in number, Iran is second highest in total number, but by far the highest on per capita figures, second to China in total number. The methods of execution, again, quite gruesome. Stoning is still part of Iranian penal code. It is still, they haven't done it for some time, but it is still part of the penal code. And despite a pledge a few years ago to ban it, the new penal code signed into law in June this year retains it. And that is shocking. Iran can still put to death juveniles. Although they have said they will end it, all they did was they said, okay, if you have a juvenile in court, they'll have a doctor make an assessment to see if the person, if the boy or girl, had capacity of knowing what he or she was doing. That's not a safeguard against juvenile execution. So I take it, I say that Iran is still a country that can execute juveniles for crimes they were committed when they were young. And the range of capital crimes is quite shocking. International law restricts capital death penalty to the most grievous crimes. That means involving a homicide. In Iran's case, well, many of you know it. You have, if you consume alcohol for the fourth time and get convicted for it, death penalty follows. You have death penalty for adult consensual sexual activity, whether heterosexual or homosexual. You have death penalty for even insulting the prophets. So there is a range of crimes for which death penalty is given in the Iranian penal code, and that is shocking. And I'm also quite disturbed by Iran's attitude towards various executive methods. I mean, there are a large number of public executions each year. 58 was last year, and these are spectacle executions where everybody comes out to watch this, and it is illegal under international law. I'm also disturbed by Iran's claim that stoning is not a method of execution, which I have no idea how to understand that. Their claim is that, well, they can get away. They can, it's as if under a hail of stones, they can get out of the hole they're in and escape, and if they do, they are left alone. Hey, come on, that's not an escape. A woman is buried up to her neck, a man up to her waist. In either of these cases, can somebody escape under a hail of stone? Either way, it's not humane, which Iran, however, insists is humane. They say the stones used are not so big, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the attitude is quite disturbing. Stoning must be banned, and so must the wide range of offenses in Iran, which provides punishment. I'm very disturbed that 80% of those put to death in Iran are for drug offenses. First of all, under international law, you cannot put people to death for drug offenses. Secondly, by and large, all these trials that I have come across, again, involve the revolutionary courts and the very poor due process standards that they uphold. So there are no safe convictions in Iran. So when you put people to death by the hundreds, 500 last year by my count, could be higher by other counts, that is very, 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 very worrying. I have written extensively about discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, and religion. Of course, I have word limitations, so I cannot go into all the details that are there. But I'm very concerned about the severe penalties that often follow minorities for practicing essentially cultural expression. I'm dealing with some Ahwazi Arabs who've been sent to death row for being involved in a cultural organization. Now, the Constitution says Iran guarantees cultural expression to its minorities, but if they actually carry out some of the activities, sometimes they're charged with very serious national security crimes and condemned to death. Iran's practice of shooting porters who smuggle across the border again creates a huge creates a huge death toll among the Kurds, who are often the poor communities who often cross the border for a living. They're not smuggling uranium. They are just taking teapots and basic food, basic necessities of life. I'm also concerned about the widespread religious persecution. The Baha'is are arguably the worst affected by this because they are called a sect, not recognized by the law, unlike the Christians and Sunni Muslims and the Jewish community, although even they face a number of acts of persecution. But I'm very concerned that the Baha'i, the Yaran, are in detention for 5 years. And if you look at the charges they faced, again, it's outrageous. They were charged with national security crimes, and the actions that were listed included writing to the UN Secretary General, writing to their own president, Ahmadinejad, writing to their former president, Mr. Khatami, and talking about the persecution of Baha'is. Now, these are termed as propaganda against the state, acting against national interest, and of course, for the Baha'is, often they add on spying for Israel. So, in any case, they face with very serious sentences, and I think they are facing 20-year sentence at the moment. In addition to the Yaran, I'm getting reports of Baha'is being targeted in terms of their economic status, destroying their economic situation. In other words, trying to destroy a community, essentially. Well, time is running out on me here today as well. I have also reported on the Yarsan, a community, again, unrecognized community within the Kurdish community who reports, again, very serious discrimination. For both Baha'i and Yarsan, if they say they're Yarsan or Baha'i, then they can't get access to university education, they often can't get employment, and they face a number of other discrimination as well. Women's plight in Iran is a matter of very serious concern to me. Of course, Iran says they have been doing very well over the past 34 years in terms of education, which is by and large true, but for the past few years, again, there are concerns about it. Although 60% of the tertiary education population are women, we now hear reports of quotas being imposed on women's access to higher education courses, and more recently of single-gendered programs, some of which are not available for women. So again, discrimination here. And of course, equally concerning is the fact that we saw a number of women candidates disqualified from the presidential election. The highest posts in the country are not accessible for women. The Supreme Leader's post, President's post, presiding judges, and so on. Of course, there are some in Parliament. Again, Iran deals with the quotas for the minorities as a ceiling rather than a floor. I've also written about the LGBT community and their plight. Again, very widely discriminated against in Iran. In fact, Iran rejects the notion that they have any rights. In the review done this May, they were told to report on the status of the LGBT community, and Iran said, well, this covenant, this treaty has no business talking about that. And they were told, well, Article 2 says you cannot discriminate on the basis of a number of things, including on sex. They said, well, sex there means dimorphic, male or female. They don't recognize that non-discrimination on sexual grounds includes sexual orientation. So naturally, the community there faces a very bad plight. Iran again tells me and tells everybody that they have a very laudable, as they say, state-funded gender reassignment program. Now, that's good as it sounds, but the way it's practiced in Iran, it's horrible. It actually puts people in a Hobson's choice between execution for being caught on certain homosexual offenses, as they say in Iran, or going to jail for being caught in the wrong type of dress or wrong type of conduct, or maiming their bodies physically, without a prior psychological or psychiatric, coaching and counseling, without even hormone therapy before the surgical process is done. This creates a lot of trauma on the people. And I said earlier about capital punishment for certain homosexual actions as well as other consensual actions. In addition to that, they face widespread harassment through social stigmatization as well. Families might reject members of the LGBT community because of the taboo that there is against it. Schools, this is in many ways a global phenomenon. The LGBT community globally face a lot of persecution. Iran, it gets a lot worse, and that's what I'm reporting in my reports. Now, time is actually up. I was going to say that I would end by giving some thoughts on the current situation in terms of a new president coming in and how we might respond to that. But before I do that, let me just add that for those who might wonder why I haven't mentioned this or that, my reports are quite comprehensive, but I am studying comprehensively the impact of sanctions on Iran. I have written questionnaires to the government of Iran to give me details of various indicators because their data is quite going to be useful in knowing exact impact of sanctions. I have referred to this previously. I've also asked UN agencies to give me data on what they're collecting. I want to know things like, such as, is iodized salt no longer available? Is infant formula no longer fortified? What the quality of water? The medical supplies are available? Whether there have been any laying of staff with the health service. Some of this data can only come from the government. It cannot be, accessed from other sources. I'm also studying the impact on Iran of pollution from the benzene-laden exhaust from cars now we have in Iran because of sanctions, as well as the reports of government's actions which may undermine the quality of lakes and other environmental reserves. I'm also concerned about the refugees in Iran, the Afghan refugees in Iran, especially the children who may now be denied access to education. So their plight, again, is under study. I hope to be able to report on this in my current report, but again, I will not know until perhaps the last minute what things I can retain because I have to respond to an evolving political situation. Last time, elections wasn't going to be my top line, but I had to make it top line because of events that developed before that time. This time, perhaps the political situation might require me to focus on that as I file my report in mid-August. A new president comes out of office on 3rd of August, and then my report is discussed in October in New York. Now, my take is, yes, I think it was long known a new president after Ahmadinejad would want to recalibrate the way they did business because the way they were going, it wasn't tenable. You had to find some other way of doing it. That's what you hear from Iran. But having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that there may be opportunities arising to engage with Iran in a positive sense. And this must not be wasted. This must be positively used and responded to. In the literature in academia, the spiral model gives many examples of countries making tactical concessions only to find that those concessions actually engage them far more deeper than they might initially like to do. Now, having said that, I also want to point out the Khatami experience. In terms of what can be done, what is feasible, and how that didn't work out. Khatami had a better deal. He had a parliament full of reformists. I don't think the current parliament actually is that reformist in outlook. So the hand he has is more limited than the hand he had. By contrast, the pressure Iran is under now is perhaps a lot more than what Iran was under in that period. The period 1999 to 2008 was a period of Afghanistan issues and Iraq issues and so on. I think Iran wasn't that much in the focus. But now it's different. Although Syria is very much there overshadowing everybody else, but the pressure on Iran now is a lot more, partly out of the nuclear file as well. But the pressure on Iran is there. So there may be opportunities now emerge in Iran that we should engage with. And I am very keen to have people think deeply about the best use people can make of that. I would be very concerned if the only people released are the Green Movement leaders, because that looks simple now. I don't think Mr. Musa, Mr. Karoubi pose a threat to the regime as it did before, but they are the only people who should come out. I think there should be a release of all detainees who are held for political reasons or for grounds of their conscience. The Baha'i leaders should be released, as journalists should be released, and so on and so forth. Equally important, it must be to find the space for Iranians to be able to express their own views and issues. So let's see the workers' union become independent. Let's see the bar council become independent. Let's see parties being sort of unbanned, as it were. Let's see NGOs allowed to operate. Let's see papers given the room to operate as per the law in the country. Let's also hear him say that he will impose a moratorium on death penalty. That's not such a radical step because Iran has been toying with the idea before. They've been saying they would do it. Now, if it's reformist president, let's hear him do it. Have a moratorium on death penalty. That's not so Sharia uncompliant also by any stretch of the word. So the idea is to find those key things that a reformist president ought to do to demonstrate both good faith and deep change rather than cosmetic change, which might give false consolation to some people and walk home, while the Iranian population still face huge challenges in terms of having their rights protected. I shall now end there. I thank you for your attention. You've been very, very generous with the time. I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Also, thank you again. I know that Natasha has been busy collecting cue cards, but you have to understand that part of the privilege of sitting here is I get to go first. And so this is a joke, but this is true also. So if I could actually maybe begin the conversation while Natasha continues to collect those cards. I'd like to come to one of your last points, if it's possible. It strikes me, watching this, that there are a lot of moving parts in the current conjuncture. One opens the New York Times today and sees a news story about Iran perhaps seeking direct talks with the US over the nuclear issue. One sees in your own reports and others economic questions within the country having to do with inflation and commodity prices. And one sees at the same time a sanctions regime that if one looks at we spoke about this just earlier, if one looks at the decisions out of the European courts, a sanctions regime that is under some stress because the data, the information, the criteria on which the sanctions are being based are often being held in confidence, and the European courts are resisting a sanctions regime on that basis. And so one sees a lot of moving parts quite at the same time as a president-elect who himself was the chief nuclear negotiator for 2 years prior, and a different political moment. And so my question then is, in this current moment, as a special rapporteur dealing with a particular country and not a thematic mandate holder, how does one think about, and even in a way strategically raise questions of human rights when these parts are moving and one is not sure where they'll go?
Well, I have tried to steer away from the nuclear file. That's not my business. And human rights deserve attention on their own merit. And that's the line I've taken, this line I will continue to take. And what I do, therefore, is to identify for the government of Iran those challenges people are concerned about, and raise awareness in the UN, among UN membership, among states, as to what's happening in Iran. I was quite surprised coming into this mandate that there was quite a low level of awareness of Iran's situation by amongst a large part of the global south, countries who are not particularly sort of in the front line on human rights issues, but nevertheless, if were aware of stoning issues and execution and so on and so forth, would perhaps be jolted from their slumber. So that awareness creation will remain an important part of the work I do, whether or not Mr. Rouhani is able to find accommodation or otherwise on the nuclear issues. For me, the ideal situation is when the focus is entirely on human rights. Often the nuclear chatter drowns out people's attention on the subject, which is just to be regretted from my perspective. So what I'm hoping to do is that a president who speaks of transparency and engagement, and one who has spoken in this campaign about a number of human rights aspects, begin to focus on those issues, such as opening up the country to better scrutiny, inviting UN rapporteurs to go to the country. That is, I think, a very critical confidence-building measure, that Iran is going to engage with UN mechanisms on discussing human rights issues. And so my job here is to raise awareness among the UN membership to see what kinds of indicators they should be looking for in Iran to determine that there is good progress or sustainable progress rather than cosmetic and superficial change, if that is a response to your question.
It is, and in fact, just for a quick follow-up to that, part of what you mentioned in your talk were the political dynamics and the renewal of the mandate. And so, in general, do you find that in holding the mandate with respect to Iran, that the questions you raise become, or not, that they raise the political fault lines around human rights in general? I'm thinking here of countries like Cuba, countries like Venezuela, and their position, not with respect to what you say, but with respect to the mandate itself, and whether or not dealing with Iran brings some countries out with respect to their positions on the human rights regime.
Well, that is broadly speaking true, but unlike my predecessors, I have the advantage that over the past, I think, decade or so, international concern on human rights has become sort of more widespread. Although, of course, the war on terrorism had its blip on this, but over the past 20 years from the Vienna conference to today, the trend has been of more countries regarding human rights as a legitimate subject for discussion at the UN. Although many countries say we don't believe in country-specific resolutions, the number is now declining. You find recently African countries got together and had a mandate on Eritrea. That's unheard of before. So now for them to come and tell me, look, we don't buy country mandates, wouldn't add up. And even generally, I regard that talking to delegates is an important part of my mandate. So I've had occasion where the Chinese delegation, now Chinese have a very clear stance that they don't regard country mandates to be a part of what is legitimate human rights framework. And that's the stance they have taken previously. But on one occasion, that was my first report, they said, well, there's one sentence, Iran must cooperate with the country mandate. And that's a very powerful message coming from China. I've had even Cuba, despite having their, the preface of we don't support this and that, nevertheless said Iran should have the mandate, cooperate with the mandate because it exists. And I found even countries, well, Venezuela had in the past been very clear that they don't support this. But apart from Venezuela, I found that even where countries have generally been unfriendly towards scrutiny on human rights, when a mandate does come into operation, they have been willing to talk to Iran either privately or publicly on the need to engage. So yes, those fault lines emerge in terms of north, south, and west, east, west, as it were. The cultural divides are there, the north-south divides are there, but there is enough concern over Iran across a coalition of countries for them to take notice. And that's why, in fact, when Iran finds that the naysayers in New York, the countries who say that Iran should not have a resolution, goes down from 50 to 30, that's a huge chunk gone in 2 years' time, in 1 year's time, in fact. So yes, I find that countries would like to present that, but when the evidence is so overwhelming, many do not want to walk away from it.
A question from the audience. What is the potential for human rights progress in Iran in the absence of democratic reform?
If you look at literature and if you look at other countries, typically countries that move towards compliance on human rights have democratic regimes or governments or systems. So the best host for human rights actually is a democratic arrangement. Now, if a country wanted to move towards human rights compliance, it would necessarily must begin to embrace democratic standards as well. So that's why the spiral model often shows that countries who embrace human rights just for tactical reasons very soon find that it spirals out of control and you have transitions to democracy. So I think, yes, they do go together, and you actually cannot have decent human rights safeguards if you have a dictatorship to run the country. But if you began to move towards human rights, if you began to embrace those human rights values and safeguards, then you begin to create the space in which democracy can be introduced to the country.
Well, I think following on that, another question from the audience really comes in a way to here, which is how can we and the questioner is asking on behalf of the diaspora community help you in your fact-finding efforts?
Well, they are already very, very helpful. Because I have not been able to go into Iran, I have had to talk to a lot of the Iranian diaspora. They are very well organized, although they may have competing groups amongst them. They are generally very well organized, very well networked, and through them I'm able to access a large number of people in country as well. And I think many of them actually engage governments across the world in raising awareness about them. For example, I understand the Baha'is in Brazil have been very effective in getting the government of Brazil to pay attention to what's happening in Iran. And likewise, when Iran communities in other countries talk to their political leaders, they would take notice. They are already well organized in the cyberspace, as it were. Again, the point here is raising awareness, making sure that valid, accurate information comes out of Iran and reaches the constituencies where people can take attention and do something about them.
It's interesting you raised that right now, because I'm in the process of reading a whole series of questions which all come to the same point, which is that you mentioned in your talk, you mentioned that world opinion matters to Iran. We discussed the reports, we discussed the things the diaspora community may be able to do or mobilize within their own countries. And then the questions that come from the audience are questions like, many reports have been written about human rights in Iran without results. What are the merits of that kind of activity? After all of these efforts, what are the results? Are there any chances for change? And so this is really a question from the audience about there's a language of human rights, there's an articulation of these rights, there are reports that are written, and there's an underlying sense that change does not happen. How does one deal with that gap? And is there any chance for change?
Well, I think we should see this in context. One should not assume that a UN report would produce one report would produce a court case at Hague, and one should also bear in mind that we're dealing with a sovereign state, a member of the UN, and within the UN's limitations on how these things are done. Now, no sovereign state is all that eager to have scrutiny of their situation done all that openly. I mean, states have traditionally tried to block scrutiny of the human rights situation as much as they can. So the system is designed to give the state as much space as possible to kind of block that scrutiny. But in recent years, that has become less so. But this also means that the most frequently used tool and the most frequently available mechanism is what is called the naming and shaming process. And this matters because countries do want to protect their reputation. And some countries perhaps more than others, because some countries which are short on domestic legitimacy will feel a lot of pressure if their external legitimacy is also severely eroded. Now, North Korea probably doesn't care either way. But for the rest of the countries in the world, if they are short on domestic legitimacy, they'll be very worried if they face criticism abroad. I think democracies can sustain better, perhaps, external criticism because they rely on domestic legitimacy. But when countries don't have that, they're very worried. Now, in Iran's case, if you look at Iran's response to these reports, in terms of delegations that go out to capitals around the world to lobby for the vote in the UN, shows that they care. Iran's attempts to win seats in the UN, for example, Iran has repeatedly sought to win a seat at the Human Rights Council. It has run twice before. It pulled out 3 years ago, and I understand it may have again withdrawn even before the the race got too hot. Again, showing its own assessment that okay, it's very unpopular. So countries that like to see themselves as champions of third world. I mean, Iran is the chairman of the non-aligned movement, and they would like all of them to like Iran. 110 countries are in that. Of course, in that group are countries who support the mandate as well. So Iran is very mindful to see how its reputation actually suffers or enhances in the global community. And this is seen, but I think, and at another level, I think there are also cases that when a case is known and spoken about, then there's a layer of protection for the victims that are concerned. It's like arguing that sunlight is a disinfectant. That if a person is languishing in prison, about which nobody knows, now there's no way that person can be protected if the pattern is to be people in prison. If the world knows somebody is going to prison, everybody is talking about it, governments usually have some leeway with regard to how they treat that person. Now, I can give some examples here. In the last debate in last year, March, in the Human Rights Council, the debate focused a lot on Pastor Yusuf Nadakhani, a Muslim convert to Christianity, became a pastor and was having a house church. And of course, Iran was very strict on that. And he was condemned to death at that point. In the debate, a number of countries expressed their outrage and shock over this kind of treatment. And in the debate, delegations were so rattled, the delegate said, well, we don't do that in Iran. And of course, having said that, Iran didn't do that. They went on and subsequently had him released. And there have been other cases where impending executions have come to the notice of the UN. They've issued, urgent press statements, and Iran has appeared to step back from this. So it's not entirely a waste, I don't think. Certainly, people I report on often tell me that they feel a degree of comfort that the case has been documented. There's also the question of the catharsis, when people feel the cathartic effect of having their case recognized. A victim feels that by being documented, that itself is in itself something useful. So while my reports will not put any Iranian perpetrator at The Hague, like Mr. Milosevic was there, these reports will document cases, raise awareness, and will provide warnings to those perpetrators that they don't have total impunity from what they do. We've seen in countries like Bangladesh, in countries like Cambodia, that when regimes change, that accountability does come in, and for that, what has happened is people's memory has to be retained. They must document and keep the information alive.
Part of this, several of the questions, in fact, from the audience, come to questions around LGBTQ members in Iran. And so the question then comes to what reports have been written. I know some of it are in your reports. Are there reports people can go to? Is there prospect for change? And I'd like to add there, is there a mobilization of the transnational NGO community around these issues with respect to Iran? And so has this become one of the key situations and cases for NGOs interested in questions around LGBTQ, questions around sexuality, to take up as part of their own work?
Well, I note that UN doesn't have a rapporteur yet on sexual minorities, but I think that's something that should be coming quite soon, because there's been, over the past few years, a lot of focus of the UN on this subject. There was a debate on this subject at the UN last year, March, and of course, a number of countries walked out, not even taking part in the debate. But at the UN level, they're pushing very strongly on the subject. Just today, High Commissioner launched in South Africa a UN initiative on this subject. So over time, I think countries will begin to embrace the importance of focusing on this subject. My reports on this subject to the UN this year did not invite criticism apart from Iran, which of course criticizes everything. And many, of course, expressed shock that Iran's treatment of LGBT community results even in death penalty for them. There has been little study done on this. Often I can refer to Human Rights Watch report from a couple of years ago on this subject. A study was done by Justice for Iran, I think earlier this year. And there are other studies in motion in various academic institutes in the UK, for example, that should come out over the next, I suppose, year or so. So this subject is getting more attention as the international community also moves towards recognizing their plight. I think there'll be more studies coming out of it. I have this as a regular subject of study in my reports, and I will keep reporting on it as I am able to develop more information on the issues that are there. I have to go through a process of verifying information so that I meet the code of conduct, in which I can hold up Iran's contention that my information is not valid. So I have to make sure I meet the threshold of validity that must be used in my reports.
Just raise the question of how one does the work, how one does the actual reporting and investigation of human rights work. And so a question from the audience that I think is very interesting is, how do you measure the state of the prisons throughout different periods? If one were looking at the state of the prisons during the era of the Shah, the prisons during the reformist era, the prisons during the era of Ahmadinejad, how would one do the measurement of the state of the prisons over this time and look for change?
Well, because I haven't been able to go to Iran, this has been one study, one area in which I'm quite limited in what I can do, but doesn't mean I cannot get information about what's going on and talk about that. Now, yes, you can look at a number of things. First of all, the prison rules themselves is a starting point. What are the rules that are in place? Then how well they measure up to what are called the SMR, the standard minimum rules that should be applied. How well are they actually applied in practice? And these relate to issues of segregation, congestion, treatment, general conduct of wardens towards inmates, and the whole gamut. So the yardstick would be the SMR and how they apply, how they've applied in Iran throughout time. Given that I am a one-man mission, I will not have the resources yet to look at, a time-bound, a time series study of prison conditions in Iran from the Shah time to the present time. But what I do know is, at the present time itself, the SMRs are not observed, and this results in widespread torture, results in other cruel treatment, and so on and so forth. So the short answer is, one should apply the SMRs and how Iran rates across these in terms of judging where they are. And ultimately, it's not a question of comparing what was better or what was worse. It's a question of ending violations as they occur, and of course, accountability for any past crimes.
Part of the core of so many of the questions one sees comes to questions that you've been working on, as far as I know, from your whole career, which are, to what extent does the international human rights regime and questions around Sharia and Sharia law, to what extent is there an inherent tension? To what extent is there a complication? To what extent is one used as a defense against the other? What is the conversation happening here? And is there a conversation to be had? And as one of the questioners asks, what are the possible contradictions, the questioner asks, between Sharia law and international human rights law?
I think the contradictions are quite well known, and they center typically around issues of minorities, issues of gender, issues of corporal punishment, the penal code and criminal law. That's broadly speaking, the issues that are there. For example, some argue Sharia law prescribes corporal punishment, the hudud penalties are there. Iran argues under Qisas law, the state cannot do anything other than offer retribution for the next of kin. So these are the issues that have been raised by some quarters as issues of tension. But if you look at the Islamic world, you don't see that many countries actually practice the form Iran does. In fact, maybe you probably have 3 or 4 countries which does that. There are countries which have banned polygamy, for example. Well, one country at least banned polygamy on the grounds that Sharia doesn't allow that. There are others who have found ways around that. So there are many ways in which countries have this brought upon reform that addresses a number of the Sharia-linked tensions in human rights law. If you look at the academic discussion on this, I think it'll be a good point would be to read Mr. Rouhani's PhD thesis, which addresses this issue. And if I haven't read that, but if he is quoting Hashim Kamali, then he has the answers to resolve. But Hashim Kamali is a leading authority on how to resolve human rights tensions with Sharia law, and he offers a number of solutions to this. One, of course, is the fact that hudud laws require certain conditions to be there, and they're not there at the moment. So he's making the case for suspension of hudud laws outright. He also cites what is called the Magasid of Sharia, the higher Sharia objectives, as means by which you can determine how you interpret Sharia in modern times to see if they conform to human rights standards. So if you apply Sharia's Magasid, then you're not focused on specific literal readings, but focusing on the outcome of justice and so on and so forth. In Toronto, Professor Khalid Abu Fadl, his notion that Sharia is about beauty and justice and truth as the overarching values of Sharia, again offers a way in which you can read a Sharia text and produce human rights compliant normative frameworks. If you go the Wahhabi route, the Salafist route, you'll not get there. But if you follow the route of the more modern Islamic scholars, you have the means for doing it. And I'm very keen to see what Mr. Rouhani's thesis did address this subject.
I'm very mindful of our time, and I know a lot of the people in the room are very interested in the current political moment. And so there are 2 very different questions here, and I'm going to let you take your pick. One is your opinion in terms of the president-elect, in terms of human rights and the human rights file, and as such, whether you're hopeful for change, whether you anticipate change. The other question is quite different, is what's the possibility of Iran ending its support of the Assad regime in Syria? And so these are different questions, but of course implicate human rights at both ends.
Well, the second question is of a different order. I should not be speaking on that as a rapporteur, although in a different context I could speak on that. But the first question is in my ballpark, so I shouldn't avoid that.
That's why I gave you a choice.
Thank you. My estimate is that, well, I'm keeping an open mind about Mr. Rouhani, because often people are locked into structural situations. The circumstances often determine what a person might do, and the past may not necessarily be the best indicator of that, although it's a good indicator. But if you are to judge on past record, then who can you actually pick up in the lineup that was there, offered by the Supreme Leader in the elections? So we have a situation, we have a president, and then we have to see what's the best way to approach him. He is saying he's going to address a number of issues. Now, of course, I have some comments on that. When he claims that he's going to have a new law on Iranians' rights and civil rights and so on, my response is, well, there is a law there already in place. Iran signed on to the ICCPR. Iran has a monistic legal system. Therefore, let the courts allow the covenant be invoked in proceedings. You don't need any more charters to be there. But if it's a charter designed to have public talking about this for 4 or 5 years, then I think it is a distraction. It's not a genuine effort. So I'll be very keen to identify what things he can do to demonstrate good faith. And if he does not do these things, then therefore, nothing has changed. But my take is the Iranian leadership recognize that they cannot go on the way they have been going on. They've seen all around them countries fall into all sorts of situations, Syria, Libya, and so on and so forth. And when you have a regime that depends on repression for survival, as it were, quite literally, then you should know that you're losing the people. So how do you then re-engage with the people? How do you then find space for you to continue? So they're looking for ways to carry on, the regime, as it were. But the cost of doing that, they would find, would be making reforms on the human rights front. And as human rights defenders, we should be mindful that that process, that deal should be based on substantive issues, not cosmetic changes. So, for example, if you would invite, say, me or the rapporteurs to go to prisons and see the place, that's a very good starting point. If you would ratify the CAT, the OPCAT and CAT as you referred to, because the Guardian Council voted this down 10 years ago. Well, the Parliament approved it. If you can get that done, you have in that a mechanism is automatic and independent to go and visit your prisons. So the question of what's going on in prisons is, I think, in a way addressed. He can set up an independent commission according to the Paris principles to have a genuine ombudsman to investigate human rights crimes. So essentially, there is a slew of things he can do which are substantive, and if he starts doing these things, then I think one should regard him as at least committed to some genuine exercise. If it's just to do with cosmetic change and superficial changes, I think the sooner we alert the world that nothing has changed, and there should be, again, vigilant on this, is fundamental.
So I will ask the last question then. It seems to me that when one talks about human rights, one is talking, of course, about a civil question, one is talking, of course, about a political question, one is talking about people's lives, and one is also talking about law. And it's the piece about law that I'd like to ask you to close on. My understanding from your own report is that the independence of the judiciary, the capacity and autonomy of lawyers to operate without fear of reprisal, without fear of losing a license, is itself one of the human rights questions that needs to be asked. If a lot of in fact, quite a few of your responses invoke law as a way of doing human rights, as a forum for doing human rights, as a mechanism for doing human rights, has there been a real conversation from the International Bar Association? Has there been a real conversation from the legal community outside of Iran and within Iran around this question about the independence of the bar within the country?
Well, the concern is there, and I'm aware that in the past few months there's been engagement with Iranian bar on this subject to raise awareness on what's going on, and again, to make their demands known that the Bar Council must be independent. That is sine qua non of rule of law, to have lawyers who would defend you in independent courts which are competent to do so, and impartial as well. So yes, that recognition is there, that effort is being made, and I think people like me and others ought to add to that chorus in demanding that this is a fundamental part of this, having a bar council independent and having due process rights protected, and therefore allow the courts to function as per in the law, allowing people the right to counsel and so on and so forth. These become fundamental aspects of it. And linked to it, of course, is also a question of impunity. Unless you have accountability for transgressions, you can never actually have rule of law embedded. That must be recognized, and that must be enforced as well. This means there's a huge agenda for him to work on, but I think unless he begins to touch upon the revolutionary courts and how they function, then, as we saw in the Khatami years, he is in danger of a reversal at any time.
Also, I'd like to thank Dr. Shaheed for his comments and his willingness to hear all of our questions tonight. I'd like to thank everybody else for coming, and if we can have a big round of applause for Dr. Shaheed for his insights tonight.
Thank you.